Dear colleagues, good day. My report is in English, and this is my first experience. I ask everyone to treat with understanding and forgive me some mistakes in pronunciation. Okay, the topic of my report is Belarusian scientific language, stages of formation in the 20th, 21st centuries. The development of Belarusian scientific language in the 20th, 21st centuries is ambiguous and contradictory. Throughout the century, Belarusian scientific language was being formed under the influence of different and sometimes opposing tendencies that determined the existence of different sceneries of the native term stock collating. It is assumed that the interpretation of the experience of previous periods contributes to its evolution, which generally assists the solution of contemporary problems of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology. Despite the fact that the terminologies of different spheres have a variety of distinctive features, the establishment of separate languages of science, elements of one national language, occurs in the mainstream, which allows you to select the dominant trends of their formation at different times and highlight positive experience that is important for usage in modern conditions. Due to a number of studies of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology, a significant practical and theoretical scientific base is created, which reflects the peculiar properties of the creation, development, and operation of Belarusian special vocabulary. However, generalizing preparation work, including the analysis of changes in the ordering of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology in different years, is still required. The purpose of work is study the major tendencies in shaping Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology, depending on the impact of extra and intralinguistic factors, which implies the identification and characterization of the most productive stages of the establishment of the national language of science and national terminology, and study of the dominant approaches of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology development during the 20th, 21st centuries. Analyzing the history of the domestic language of science and terminology development, one can say there are periods which, on the one hand, reflect the historical sequence of the accomplished terminology work and are characterized by a greater or lesser activity of terminological activities, and, on the other hand, have different duration, goals, and objectives of terminology work, and approaches to develop a special vocabulary. When exploring sociolinguistic aspects of literary language functioning in the second half of the 20th century, linguists come to the conclusion that, it's from Krasniy Viktor Petrovich, for each stage one can find a dominant idea which, to some extent, determines inner nature of the language situation, peculiarities of the social, cultural, and linguistic orientation of the society, and the direction of active processes in different areas of linguistic activity, and the structure of the Belarusian language itself. In any case, in accordance with general tendencies of language of science and national terminology formation in a given period, the advantage is given to some ways of terminology harmonization that retain their position as the main ones or lose them. The periods of the so-called terminographical explosion, that is the time of the most efficient preparation of terminological handbooks and dictionaries, can be considered an expressive confirmation of terminological activities. In its turn, the ups and downs of the terminology work are closely related to the external conditions of the Belarusian language functioning. Until the early 20th century, the task of the development and codification of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology was not set, with the exception of the dictionaries and reference books for reading old Belarusian legal acts, which, however, had a specific limited function. The researchers note that in terms of terminology work, early 20th century is characterized by spontaneous and controlled formation of nominative terminological fund of the Belarusian language. At the same time, the creation of Belarusian terms is carried out mainly on folk basis. The creators of so-called Sieben-Sprachen-Wörterbuch, where the Belarusian language was put in line with German, Russian, Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Yiddish for the first time, were trying to capture the spirit of the languages and listen to the timid attempts of the people who, driven by natural intentions, try to create new words for new unfamiliar concepts. The authors noted that the word once found and selected from the list of synonyms acquired a certain value, and from then on, the variant was considered to be in full compliance with the German word. For example, Belarusian – арендар, арендатор, удавальник, отдать на сховку, уласність, питоманність, хата для суду, безправне присобечення, спрокуть, and others. Due to the limited nature of the Belarusian language functioning, not all the equivalents could be considered at the time of preparation of the lexicon as regulatory ones, and not all of them entrench themselves in the future. From a modern point of view, not all the suggestions of the first half of the 20th century are successful. Some lexical items have received the status of colloquial today. For example, instead of Belarusian обіцянка, обіцяння, обовязок became naturalized instead of Belarusian отговор, отмена, скасование. Instead of Belarusian отклад, отдаль, переволока, оттерминовка. Instead of Belarusian лиходейство, злоуживание, law. Primarily, the names that were reflecting the level of public relations, development and management at the occupied territories passed out of active use. For example, German Amtsbezirk der Chefsverwaltung, Belaruskaya, Okruг. German Amtsbezirk der Amtsvorstehers, Belaruskaya, Округ начальника управления. German Polizeistunde, Belaruskaya, полицейская година. German Gemeindevorstand, Belaruskaya, волостный урад. The loss of some nominations took place due to the fact that the components of collocations went out of active use and came to the receptive vocabulary. So, in Belarusian collocations, привилея на шинкарство, закладная кредитка, карная господа, the components шинкарство, кредитка, and господа are qualified as archaic. The origin of lexical items, уласність, складанка, платежа, owe their origin to Northwest dialects, but the suggestions of Sieben-Sprachen-Wörterbuch, Belarusian, батьковская уласть, складанка, срок платежа didn't spread further and were replaced. In modern, most complete references, батьковская улада, узнос, are used respectively with the variants of the 20s. Укладка, узнос, складка, уклад, заплата, ахверование, термин платежу. Despite the fact that not all solutions on Belarusian terminology adjustment were reflected later on, and the period itself is characterized more as spontaneous one, it is important to note that it was the time when first attempts were made to carry out terminology work on the basis of the Belarusian language means. Purposeful process of terms creation took place in the 20s, 30s of the 20th century during the functioning of Terminology Commission. In the 20s, it is from Zaprutsky College. In the 20s, the formation of the body of the Belarusian scientific language was carried out alongside with the establishment of Belarusian statehood, next to the construction of research and educational institutions network in the conditions of democratization of education and science. The formation of Belarusian part of the lexicons was influenced by objective, undeveloped Belarusian terminology, unsolved theoretical problems of terminological vocabulary translation, lack of Belarusian equivalents for a number of foreign language terms, and subjective influence of the points of view of lexicons authors' reasons. According to the opinion of the terminological activities, research of this period, distinctive for Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology of this time was acceleration of its development. There were external causes of targeted terms creation, like the expansion of public functions and social base of the Belarusian language, when it became a state language, became the language of the record-keeping, science, education, culture, political, and imaginative literature, the language of the media. It's from Лексикология белорусской мовы. The initial phase of the terminological system creation is characterized by terminologization of nationwide, geographically limited and narrow dialect words. For example, Гарляк, today Гартань, Дедино серце, today Вобласть серця, Жовтяк, today Жовтєвий пузир, Пасака, лимфа, дванастки, today дванадцатипалая кишка, покрытницы, today эпителий, слизницы, слизистая оболочка. It's from medicine. In the 1930s, the Belarusian language is not often claimed in the field on scientific communication. Naturally, the dictionaries created in the 1920s fell into disuse and were even forbidden. Accordingly, the ways and means of the Belarusian language vocabulary standardization, based on the ideas of purisms, lost their relevance and legal power. By this time, Belarusian period before the outbreak of hostilities on the territory of Belarus is considered to be anti-puristic, characterized by a change in the orientation of terms formation to the Russian language sample, and the intensification of the Russian language loan tracing, which became the only sources of replenishment of the terminological lexicon. For example, огибаючая, одночлен, быстро вагаючиеся, кривые, вертящиеся, изображение, квадрат, точный, множитель, интегрующий, поменьшаемое, mass terminology. The next period. In the 50s, 80s, there appeared an intensive for terminological activities and normalization of terminological means. It was development work on large encyclopedias like Belarusian Soviet Encyclopedia in 12 volumes, the 5-volume Encyclopedia of Literature and Art. Few dictionaries of that period were made up in accordance with the principle on convergence of Belarusian and Russian terminology and terminological work itself was carried out without necessary sequence. It looked like a terminological system to developed were selected by chance. Distinctive in this connection became the leading role played in terms creation by the Russian language, which was stimulated by several factors. The increasing role of the Russian language as the language of inter-ethnic relations, social and economic unity of the peoples of the USSR, a high degree of scientific and technical terminology development in the Russian language. The morphological method of tracing is used excessively, or Russian terms are given a certain phonomorphological look in accordance with the peculiarities of the Belarusian language, while national compliance goes under the radar. The next period. In the 90s of the 20th century, when the Belarusian language got an official status, the impact of the national factor revealed itself. After the referendum in 1996, which resulted the Russian language getting the status of a second state language in Belarus, again the Belarusian language in science began to feel a stepdaughter. When characterizing the term's creation activities in the second half of the 90s of the 20th century, it's noted that this time is characterized by a tendency to manifestation of specific features of the national language, which finds analogy with terms creation in 2090s, combined with the tendency to internationalization, which corresponds to a similar tendency in the 1950s, early 1990s, due to its recession role of the English language in international communication. In the 21st century, the development of theoretical and practical issues of Belarusian terminology, the task of its ordering and the analysis of its functioning under the conditions of the apparent narrowing of the Belarusian language use scope remain important and urgent. Modern level of Belarusian terminology, its lack of ordering, and sometimes the lack of developed terminological systems in different fields of knowledge does not quite correspond to the modern state of Belarusian science and is significantly lower than the level of its problem solution in other countries of the world. In early 21st century, it seems necessary to replace intuitive approach by reasoned one that will lead to the objectivity of the result and a significant increase in the level of linguistic research. In this regard, the exclusion of subjectivity in the judgment of linguistic facts can become a guarantee of the true assessment of the tendencies of shaping and development of special vocabulary of the Belarusian language. In modern conditions, the task of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian language terminology, sub-body developing, is becoming more actual, which to some extent will help overcome the conflict between language practice and the recommendation of terminological dictionaries drafters. Multilingual databases that allow collecting and storing information on the particularities of the terms and their use, equivalence and the degree of ordering are becoming the means of fixing of international solution on streamlining the semantic of terms. Modern efforts of terminology harmonization allow for terms internationalization, that is, correlation of the meaning of multilingual terms close in form with the definition of exact matches between them. as well as the choice of the terms with international forms out of the number of synonyms. The so-called integration of research and general science today is manifested largely in the use of English borrowings, terminological units, Anglicism intensively penetrate into the technical, humanitarian, and natural science terminology. One of the urgent tasks of the present stage of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian terminology development is its unification and standardization. The tendency to terminology structure unification dictate the necessity to apply a wide international experience of terminology development rather than to narrow the search by any single vector. Thus, as a result of study stages of formation of Belarusian scientific language and Belarusian national terminology in the 20th, 21st centuries, in its history, one can distinguish the most productive periods of terminological activity. The activity of its implementation was stimulated by the impact of the so-called extra-linguistic factors alongside with linguistic ones. Each stage in turn is characterized by having distinct approaches and methods of forming the terminology. Complex recognition of social and historical circumstances of the domestic terms formation lets us determine the dominant processes in its development. Despite a long period of the formation of Belarusian national terminology, the existence of different variants of its harmonization, natural way of harmonization, and conscious terms creation as a result of language policy, standardization of term spheres, and development of terminological systems continue up to the present day. The task of national terminology fund streamlining determines primarily the conduction of historical and linguistic analyses, which will let access the state of development of the specialized vocabulary at a certain period, trace the dynamics of its changes, and single out for examples of good practice. Thank you very much for your attention.